from so many different parts of the world. I hope your bees are all doing well. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Peter Connor. I'm one of the trustees in the Cambridge Beekeepers Association, and I'm being joined this evening by my three brilliant assistants, Sally Knowles, Ninky Bloomer, and Jackie Finn, who are working tirelessly in the background to keep all of the technology working tonight. Before we start, I'd just like to remind everyone about a bit of Zoom etiquette. Please mute yourselves for the duration of the talk. And if you're planning on having dinner or lunch, depending on your time zone, then please also turn off your camera. Please forward any questions to the chat so that we can interrogate Professor Seeley after the end of his talk. Just as a reminder, as you've just heard, this talk is being recorded and will be available to CBK members in the next few days. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, or if there's one bee researcher who needs no introduction, then it's Professor Tom Seeley, who I'm sure is familiar to everyone here. Professor Seeley is the Horace White Professor in Biology at the Department of Neurobiology and Behaviour at Cornell University, and the author of many groundbreaking and fascinating books on bee behaviour, such as The Wisdom of the Hive, Honeybee Democracy, and The Lives of Bees. Yesterday saw the publication of his latest book, Piping Hot Bees and Boisterous Buzzrunners. There's a link to the Northern Bee Books website in the chat for those of you in the UK who have for some reason not yet ordered your own copy. We're delighted that Professor Seeley is able to join us this evening and share some of the insights from his new book. So Tom, without further ado, can I pass it over to you, please?
Okay, I might need your help making sure I do this correctly. I'm going to share my screen, and then here's the talk. Oops, what did I do wrong?
Oh, looks good so far.
Yeah, except I can't see my presentation. Where did it? What did I do? And I don't know the talk quite well enough to give it without seeing the images. So
Well, Zoom is telling me that you started sharing.
yes, I started sharing, but I've lost the PowerPoint. Oh, good grief.
Just to reassure everyone, it all worked flawlessly in the rehearsal.
Let's pull it right up. Those are old ones. Let's see.
Do you want to stop sharing and try again?
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe that's the best thing. So that would involve me leaving the meeting, or
no.
Just stop sharing.
I can do that for you. Oh yeah.
Okay.
So.
Okay.
Sorry. Yeah. Back to the gallery. We're on PCs and Tom is on a Mac. So if anybody is brilliant with Macs, do jump in at any time.
Where did that go?
Is it behind us? Behind? If you make a small on your screen, move the zoom, you can see it. Did you close it? Yeah. Ah, now we're looking at your screen.
And your desktop.
I think that was your screen. I don't know whose that was actually.
Put it over here on the side. No.
Have you got the PowerPoint up?
No, that's what disappeared. That's the puzzling thing for me.
I mean, do you want to go out of the room, Tom? Leave Zoom and have a look and then come back in.
Let me see.
I think it's possible.
Yeah. Somebody speak. You've been muted. Sorry, whoever you are, Angus. Somebody muted you.
You must open the PowerPoint and then share screen.
Yeah, no, I think if you go to the top of your screen, you'll see the three little dots, the red dot, the yellow dot, and the green dot. If you click on the green dots, that will minimize the window that you're in, and you'll be able to see your other windows behind it. I'm on a Mac as well.
Angus, that's really helpful.
Thank you.
Tom's muted at the minute.
So we have very, very tough rules here, Angus.
Yeah. So okay, now I'm
Ooh, you're muted.
Tom is
Somebody's
muted.
You've muted
Yeah.
Tom now, whoever.
Not
I
guilty.
think I'm gonna leave the meeting and see if I can find that presentation.
Okay.
Yeah, now he's gone off, left us.
Yep.
Yes.
He'll be back momentarily.
Angus, do you feel you can join in? You know,
Sure. If when Tom comes back, if he wants to share his screen again so
Yeah.
we can see his desktop, I might be able to talk him through it if I
Yeah,
can see what's
yeah.
what.
I mean, we did a trial. Peter did a trial with him beforehand, and it works.
Yeah, it worked
So we
fine.
know it's there.
Failing that, I see Carl Collier has joined us, who's giving our next talk, and might have to rope you into doing it a couple of weeks early, Carl.
Okay.
Or otherwise, Peter could talk about something about bees swarming.
Wasn't my bees. As far as I know, I wasn't at home during daylight to go and have a look. But
That's what everyone says. Well, my bees.
Trying to figure this out.
Carl, we can't hear you.
Oh, was that me? That's you are talking to Carl.
Carl was talking for a second. Yes, it says Carl is talking at the top of my screen.
Oh God. I can do a presentation whenever you wish. It was prepared and finished yesterday, just in time, so that it's ready to be done whenever. But
Is Tom in the waiting room? Is Tom in the waiting room?
not
I've
that
got
I
a
can see.
backlog of
He doesn't
books
want
I'm
to. No,
reading.
he is. No. I hope he hasn't deleted his talk.
Are you still recording, Sally?
Oh yes. Sorry.
You might want to.
Got into trouble. Okay, so okay. Now I will go to full screen, I believe. And that's this one down here. There we go. Is this working for you folks now?
Not yet.
You might need to make Tom a co-host so he can share.
Oh yes, actually, sorry. We made him a co-host before he left. So
Haven't had to in the past,
okay.
but we can.
Well, let's see. Maybe I haven't. There's some button that I haven't pressed, perhaps.
On my screen.
So what do you see do you see anything?
Just you,
Maybe I
Tom.
haven't.
Just you.
Okay.
Now you started sharing your screen. We can see your Zoom account, but no credit card
Okay.
details.
Launch meeting.
No, you don't want to. You're already in the Zoom. You're already in
Zoom. So you want to press the share screen button on the Zoom.
I saw it at the end.
Yeah.
We can bypass.
Is that
Yay! We're
working?
there. Yes.
Looks like we're in.
Very good. So I'm going to reduce this a little bit. Good. Well, we made it. So I'll dive right in without further ado. As you can see, the title of this talk is 5 Wondrous Behaviors of Honeybees. Let's see, Tom, use this little thing here. I want to start with a quote, sharing a quote with you. This is by a gentleman named Vincent B. Wigglesworth. The honeybee is as far above the general run of other insects as man is above all his fellow mammals. The complexity of the social life of honeybees, their powers of mutual communication, their diversity in skills and employment, their debates and decisions on policy are all so remarkable that they raise the question of the capacity of the worker honeybee for thinking. And this quote sets the tone, it sends the message for this entire talk, particularly the words that are highlighted in yellow, their powers of mutual communication, their diversity in skills and employment. Now, one of the things that I like about giving this talk to you folks right today is that, well, here is Vincent Bryan Wigglesworth, Sir Vincent. He was a fellow of the Royal Society, and he was the Quick Professorial Fellow of Cambridge University from 45 to 66. So we have a really special connection. Those of you that are in the Cambridgeshire Beekeepers Association have a close connection to this talk. Now, here are the 5 remarkable skills that we will look at and how the worker bees do these 5 things. Provide directions to important places, rouse sleepy hive mates in the morning, call for help in unloading nectar, request help in grooming, and prevent mass asphyxiation in their hives. So these are five really, I think, remarkable skills, as you'll see. I think you'll agree with me. So behavior 1 is providing directions to important places. And I want to emphasize the part that's in the parentheses here. Without marking or leading the way. There are many animals that provide directions to important places, but it's almost always, with very few exceptions, involves marking or leading the way. And we human beings are very good at providing directions without marking or leading the way. And the remarkable thing is that, to the best of my knowledge, honeybees are the only other animals that can do this, that can abstractly provide the directions to an important location. And they do it, and we'll see if this works or not. They do it, of course, with their waggle bees. He waggles comes around, waggles comes around. And I like to think of and you can too, think of a bee's waggle dance as a miniaturized reenactment inside the hive of her flight outside the hive to the flower patch. So for example, a bee, imagine you're a bee and you're working the flowers here. Your home is here. You take note that the line from your home to the flowers is 40 degrees to the right of the direction of the sun. So when you come inside the hive and you do your waggle dance on the vertical comb, you walk forward at an angle 40 degrees to the right of straight up. And you've noted on your flights out to the flowers how far it was, and that's a measure of the distance. So they use the energy expended, actually, the distance to the food source, and you can indicate that in the duration of the waggle runs in your dance. So that's, as I say, giving direction and distance information abstractly is very special. We do it. And you probably all know this was deciphered by Carvin Frisch. I like to show his picture in his honor in this talk. He deciphered the waggle dance in 1945. And I really like this old time picture. This is what he looked like when he received the Nobel Prize. I like this picture of him from 1923 when he was doing an experimental tests of odor discrimination by bees. He had trained bees to come to a feeding station with a certain scent. And then he'd put out these boxes. He'd take away the feeding station, put out the boxes, and see which one the bees would come to. There'd be a different scent in each of the 4 boxes. And this is clearly the one that was the training scent, held the training scent. Now, here's a question for you. Does a forager honeybee adjust her dance only in relation to the food source's direction and distance? Well, the answer is no, but it's not well known that she also adjusts her dance in relation to the food source's desirability. And by desirability, I'll be clear, be a little more precise on that. A bee measures the desirability of a nectar source by its energetic profitability, we don't know how they assess the desirability for pollen sources, but we do know that for nectar sources, it's the energetic profitability. And this is expressed more precisely in terms of the energy gained on a nectar collecting trip divided by the energy spent on a nectar collecting trip. And so the higher that, the greater the energy gain, the profitability, I should say, or the longer a bee's waggle dance lasts. Now that's illustrated in this graph here. And this is looks like a very simple graph, but it's actually the result of about a month's work. So I'm going to go through it in a little bit of detail. Just on the horizontal axis was the profitability of a sugar water feeder that I had bees visiting. And each of these colored lines reflects the dance response, how many waggle runs a bee performed when she got back to the hive after visiting a feeder that was of this level of profitability or some other level of profitability. And you can see that as the energetic profitability of the feeder increased, more joules were gained per joule spent collecting the food, the more strong the dance response was, the more waggle runs a bee produced. And you can also see that there's a lot of individuality in their responses. This bee that was marked by the yellow line, she was a very strong dancer. She'd do 15 waggle runs even when the profitability wasn't very high, and she'd crank it up to 50 waggle runs every time she got back to the hive. Whereas at the other extreme, there is this bee marked by these red symbols. She never danced at all. And then there's some that are intermediate. And this was the overall mean response of these bees. The more the profitability of the feeder, the food source, the more waggle runs, the more dance circuits, and thus the greater the duration of the dance. As I say, that takes a lot. The reason it's so hard to get this is to get this data, you have to know for each bee how much she loaded up, how quickly she flew home, how much time she spent in the hive, how much time it took her to fly back, all that stuff. You have to know all of those things. So main point is, though, that we now know that when a nectar forager performs a waggle dance, she encodes three things about the food source: direction, distance, desirability. You can think of these as the three Ds of the waggle dance. And this is the first two when Frisch worked out very clearly, but we've learned about the desirability more recently. The other thing that last graph showed is that showed very clearly that worker bees have individual personalities. Some bees same bees going to the same food source, some will dance readily and others do not. And I think that's something that we probably all appreciate, but it's been hard until you do this kind of experiment. You can't really quantify the personalities of bees, but they showed it very clearly in their willingness to do dances for this very same food source. Some were strong dancers, some were weak dancers. Behavior 2 is a different behavior. Again, it's a communication behavior. It's calling for help in unloading nectar. And most of you have probably seen this behavior where a returning nectar forager comes in the hive, sometimes with a bulging abdomen because her honey stomach is full. And then she's met by a nectar receiver. And her abdomen is not bulging because she's empty. Her honey stomach is empty, but her tongue is out and she's drinking up the nectar that's being regurgitated by the nectar forager. And it's fun to, when you're doing your beekeeping and it's a honey flow is on and you see this interaction, it's fun to watch it because you'll see this bee's abdomen gets smaller and smaller and this one gets bigger and bigger. So, but there's a problem. It looks like a smooth operation, but there's situations where sometimes the nectar forager needs to call for help on unloading nectar. And this diagram, I think, makes it clear how this situation arises where she has to call for help. The nectar acquisition process is a two-stage process. There's a collecting cycle done by the nectar foragers, and then there's the processing cycle where the nectar receiver gets nectar, takes it up to the combs, put some of it in the honeycombs, but may also pass some off to other bees. And for this whole process to work smoothly, the two rates at which these two operations are occurring, the collecting and the processing, they have to be matched. If a lot of bees are collecting nectar, but there's not many bees processing nectar, you get a backlog. These bees have trouble getting, the foragers have trouble getting unloaded. And conversely, if you had a lot of nectar receivers, but not much nectar collection going on, then these nectar receivers are wasting their time standing around the entrance. So the bees have to have a way to keep these two things in balance if they're going to work efficiently. And they do have a system. So yeah, just to emphasize, the complication of this whole thing is the rate of nectar collection varies greatly. So the need for nectar receivers varies greatly. And just to share with you an analogy, up along the coast of the eastern U.S., northeastern U.S., there used to be a big industry of sardines back when the herring were plentiful. But the catch of the herring was variable from day to day. And so the factory owners had to have a way of calling for more on the days when a lot of fishing boats came in with herring. They had to be able to call up the workers that would do the packing. And their system was a factory whistle. There was a factory whistle atop these sardines. And when there were a lot of fishing boats coming in with a herring, they sounded the whistle, and folks in the town would come and do the packing. So the question here is, do the nectar foragers have a factory whistle to call for more nectar receivers when there's a honey flow starting up? And a lot of not herring, but a lot of nectar needs to be processed. Indeed, they do. And what is the bee's factory whistle? Well, it's another dance. It's not the waggle dance. It's the tremble dance. And I've got a video, and we'll see if it comes through for hopefully for some of you. Here's a bee doing the tremble dance. And I'll say it in words. This bee's walking around. Hopefully you can see she's moving, but she's not moving around in circuits like the waggle dancer. She's just kind of walking slowly around, and her body, I hope you can see this, is trembling back and forth. And you can see other bees are orienting to her. They're checking her out. And so she's getting attention from other bees. And we know now that this tremble dance is performed by stymied nectar foragers that have visited a very rich nectar source, but have come into the hive and have having trouble getting unloaded, having trouble finding a nectar storer bee. And this is a graph based on a study I did, which illustrates very clearly how the very same bee coming back from a rich nectar source, she will switch from doing a waggle dance to doing a tremble dance. And what this depends on is how long she has to search to find a nectar receiver. So if a bee comes in from a very profitable nectar source and she only needs 20 seconds or less, she has a high probability of doing a waggle dance. But if she comes in from the same food source, and it takes her 60 seconds or more, she's going to do a tremble dance. And then if you were an engineer, you'd say, wow, this is a beautiful system, because there's this intermediate zone where the system is actually pretty well balanced, and they need no dance is needed. Neither more foragers are needed, and nor more nectar storers are needed. So but the bee's rule is short search, do a waggle dance if it's a good food source, long search gives rise to a tremble dance. And the tremble dance is directed at to activate more of the bees to function as the nectar receivers. But I wanted to, it's one thing to see this pattern, but I wanted to really do a test to see if I could see if it was the difficulty of unloading, or maybe something else that was causing the nectar foragers coming into the hive to do the tremble dance, because there are a lot of things. Maybe they could pay attention, they could just sense the amount of nectar, the traffic of their fellow foragers coming into the hive. So I wanted to do an experiment to test this idea that it was the unloading difficulty that gave rise to the tremble dance. And so what I did is I took a honeybee colony up north to a vast forest land where there's no forage. And I provided a sugar water feeder. So now I was in control of the nectar supply, and I could do a real clean experiment. And what I found was, and what's plotted here is, I set up a colony in an observation hive. And on one day, I only let a few bees go out to my feeder. And so there were only 2.7 foragers per minute coming into the hive on the 19th of July. Low nectar influx, low sugar water influx, technically. And I kept track of the cumulative number of nectar receivers that I labeled in the hive, the bees that came over to my labeled foragers and received nectar. And you can see it went up to about 500, but that was about it across the whole day. This is the full day of eight hours. Now, the next day, I changed things because I was in control of the amount of nectar that the colony could collect, or sugar water the colony could collect. Now I made the feeder a lot larger, and I let a lot more bees go out to that feeder, and now when I labeled, and now the bees were doing tremble dances. And on this day, the total number of bees that I labeled as nectar receivers wasn't 500 or 600, it was over 2,000 bees. So this tremble dance really does make a big difference in the number of nectar receivers in a colony. A historical note here. The tremble dance was first reported in the 1920s by Carl von Frisch, and translated from his paper back in 1923 where he wrote about this. He says, at times one sees a strange behavior by bees who have returned home from a sugar water feeder or other goal. It's as if they had suddenly acquired the disease St. Vitus's dance. That's an old name for a neurodegenerative disease. Huntington's chorea, I believe you call it today. And it always puzzled him. And he told one of my friends, who is Martin Lindauer, he said, told him, if anybody figures out what that tremble dance means, I'll give him a prize. But unfortunately, Carl von Frisch passed away in 1973, and we didn't figure out the tremble dance until the late 1980s, or early 1990s, I forget which. So that's the tremble dance. Now, here's the third behavior, and it's a behavior that's involved in activating hive mates, and we call this behavior the shaking signal. And you can see why we call it this. This is the bee that's doing the shaking signal. She just grabbed another bee by the thorax, and then she shakes her body up and down, dorsoventrally, mostly with the abdomen, but that vibration, that shaking back on the rear part of the body, it's transmitted through her forelegs into another bee, shaking signal. And this is for activating hive mates, as we will see. Again, try a video. Active forager, I'll go along with the arrow. We'll see an active forager shaking inactive. Shakes. Excellent. Shakes another bee. Shakes another. Now, you might be wondering, well, why do foragers sometimes have to activate other foragers? Aren't they all ready to go? Well, they're not always ready to go because foragers go to sleep at night and on days of poor weather. And they really do sleep. It's not just an analogy. It's a real physiological matchup between what bees do and we do. And the 5 criteria of any organism for sleeping are immobility, body hanging, lose muscle tone, body hanging limply, slow breathing, temperature drop, resistance to disturbance. And these bees, these are examples of sleeping bees, and they fulfill all of these criteria. You can poke these bees at night, these sleeping bees. They're hanging limply, slow rate of breath, breathing, low body temperature, and you can poke them and they resist disturbance. They don't wake up. And here's one that I like this one. She's just hanging, dangling by her two legs here. She's deep asleep, not moving around, just hanging, just with her claws, tarsal claws embedded in a bit of wax. And they will sleep for hours, getting good rest. So these successful foragers are woken up with the by the shaking signals, and successful foragers produce the shaking signals to wake up other foragers when they need to be woken up. And its message, as we'll see, is wake up. And it was this particular bee, whose name is red abdomen, or red thorax, white abdomen, or red white for short. She was the bee that revealed to me the meaning of the shaking signal one summer. You see, I was doing a study about waggle dances, and it was this study, my investigation up in this deep forest area, it was interrupted by 3 days of rainy weather. And red white was the first bee to return to my feeder. And this gives you a little glimpse of what my feeders look like. There's a plexiglass plate with grooves machined into it. And on top of that, there is a small jar that holds the sugar solution. And the bees come up to it, they put their tongue in the groove, and they can take out the sugar solution. And it makes it very easy to see when a bee has come and to take note of who she is. So red white was the first bee to return to my feeder on the sunny morning following the 3 days of rainy weather. And I was there tending the feeder, and I had two helpers back at the hive. And the hive was an observation hive. So I saw red white arrive. I saw her load up, and I called over the walkie-talkie to one of the helpers, and Anya, red white's about to come back, and I bet when she gets back, I bet she's going to do a super duper waggle dance. Very excited waggle dance. But the helper, Anya, reported in and said, Tom, that bee, she's back now, but she's not doing a waggle dance. She's walking around. It looks like she's grabbing other bees and shaking them. And so I said, okay, start counting how many bees are shaken by red white. And here's what the counts were for this one bee on this one morning. On her first trip back, she wore on in the hive, she shook 48 other bees. Then she went back to the feeder. Next time, came back, shook 56 bees or something like that. And you could see for the first 10 or so trips back to the hive, she didn't do any waggle dances. She just did shaking signals. And then she started combining doing shaking signals with waggle dances. But it wasn't until really the middle of the day that she switched over to being excited about doing just waggle dances. So this is a really clear example of how when a colony has been asleep or inactive for a while, successful foragers do lots of shaking signals to wake their fellow foragers up. They may be waking up the middle-aged bees, the nectar receivers as well, but I'm not sure of that. So here again is this shaking. Incidentally, that shaking signal you just saw or maybe saw, that wasn't in a hive, that was on the side of a swarm, and that was a bee on a cool morning on a swarm. She was helping the swarm bees get ready, warm up, become active, and get ready to fly to their new home site. Behavior 4, requesting help in grooming. And I don't know how many of you, probably most of you, have looked closely at worker bees with their very fuzzy bodies, if they've been out collecting nectar. And you can see they get collecting pollen. You can see they get pollen grains all over their body. And this particular bee was foraging on dandelions. And worker bees possess combs on each leg for dealing with this pollen, to collect it off their body and get it into their pollen baskets. And they also use these combs for dealing with wax if there's junk inside the hive that they have to remove. And the way it works is the bees use the hairs on the combs on their forelegs and middle legs to clean the forepart of their body. And then they use this comb on the one of the hind legs to get the pollen that's been collected on the foreleg and the mid leg onto this comb, and then the bee to get the pollen loaded up into the pollen basket on the tibia. What she does is she will scrape this set of combs with the rake on the other leg, and this will push up, that'll push the pollen up into this pollen press region. And then when she can close the leg up, it pushes the pollen up into the pollen basket. It's a little tricky to put into words. It's pretty easy to see though, when you're looking at bees that are out in a foraging from a good pollen source. They will pause, they will hover, and you can watch them do their fancy leg work to get the pollen off their body and up into the pollen basket. So bees are very good at cleaning pollen off their bodies, but they have a hard to groom places. And this is illustrated by this bee that was foraging on Himalayan balsam. It is unable, it can't get its legs to clean around the wing joints and particularly the top of the thorax. So what's a bee to do if it's starting to feel like its wings aren't working quite right because there's so much pollen messing up that smooth operation of that joint? What's a worker bee to do? Well, she calls for help by performing a special dance, calls for help in grooming by performing a special dance. And here's what this grooming invitation dance looks like. She's in the hive, she's on the comb, she spreads her 6 legs widely, and she implants her tarsi carefully so that and she shakes her body back and forth. This is the grooming invitation dance. And in ways that we don't fully understand, bees that are nearby can detect this shaking. It's probably coming through the vibration of the rims of the cells. They will respond, they will come over to the bee that's doing the shaking, and climb onto the bee that was doing the shaking, was doing the invitation, the grooming invitation. And the bee that was doing the grooming invitation, she will nicely spread her wings to allow the groomer to get up and clean the wing joints, the wing hinges, and also the part of the petiole that she can't clean herself. So that's each of these grooming episodes takes about 8 seconds. Now, you might be wondering, does getting dirty evoke this dance? In other words, is this a kind of dirty dancing? And because it's not just that this dance, as it turns out, this grooming invitation dance, is not performed just in response to being overloaded with pollen, but also with debris that can drop onto bees, bits of comb and things like that inside the hive. And so to answer this question, does getting dirty evoke this dance? I worked with a student who did a very simple study. He had an observation hive where he could take off the glass on one side, and he would puff one at a time 30 worker bees, either with chalk dust or with clean air. And then he locked his eye on that bee. This was the hard part. He had to watch that bee because the bee had to watch that bee for 10 minutes. It wasn't hard to follow the bees that got puffed with chalk dust, but the bees that got puffed with clean air, that was hard. He really had to work hard. His name was Ben. And here's what he looked for was he compared, first of all, whether there was a difference in self-grooming between the bees that got puffed with chalk dust or got puffed with clean air. And you can see a big difference. If a bee was puffed with chalk dust, almost all of them self-groomed, and if it was clean air, very few of them self-groomed. That was interesting, but that wasn't surprising. What was more telling was, did the bee then, if it was puffed with chalk dust, did it perform a grooming invitation dance? And you can see here again, the results are very clear. If a bee got puffed with chalk dust, well, of the 30 bees, 15 did a grooming invitation dance and 15 didn't. But if a bee was puffed with clean air, well, during those 10 minutes after she was puffed with clean air, only 1 did a grooming invitation dance. The other 29 did not. So that's very strong experimental evidence that this chalk dust elicits the grooming invitation dance, and thus its function is help with cleaning. Last behavior is preventing mass asphyxiation. And we all know from our own colonies of bees that inside each one of our boxes, there are a lot of bees, and sometimes there's just a small entrance. So why don't colonies suffer asphyxiation from carbon dioxide? Well, they don't, because they have this very powerful means of ventilating their nest by using the fanning behavior. And this is a very special behavior. It involves the bee posturing her body just so that she's blowing air rearward, um, not trying to generate lift as in flight. And her wing movements are different than the wing movements in flight, but they have greater amplitude than when she's flying. So they're really built for moving air, but not for generating lift. And as I say, special body posture that pushes the air rearward. And this is these wing movements for ventilation are very effective. It can generate airflows of up to 1.5 liters per second, especially if there's a bunch of bees clustered together, making like a little team. And what I find remarkable is the air jet velocities. If you measure them right here, you can put particles in the air and use a laser to measure the speed of the air movement. Those are jet velocities are up to 3 meters per second. That's very powerful ventilation. And you can feel that, I'm sure many of you have, by putting your hand behind those bees. Hang on. This behavior is usually performed for cooling the nest, but sometimes for ventilating the nest. You might be wondering, well, how do the bees know when the CO2 level in their home is too high? Well, the bees have specialized olfactory cells on their antennae that are specifically to carbon dioxide. This is very unusual. There aren't many animals that have CO2 receptors, but honeybees do, and it's because they live in crowded cavities, in high density in cavities. And they ventilate their nest when the CO2 level gets above about 0.5%. And for 0.5% doesn't sound like much, but it's pretty stuffy because fresh air is now about 0.04%, so 10 times less than what triggers the ventilation. And here's some recordings of these CO2 sensitive cells. These were made in Germany back in the 1960s by an investigator who didn't know much about bees, but he had a cylinder of CO2 in the laboratory. He was studying their ability to detect floral scents, but he blew some CO2 off across the antenna when he had a probe in one of the antennae, and he saw this firing and for some of these olfactory cells. And you can see that at air, very little firing. It was 0.03% back in the 60s. 0.5% firings picks up. This is when the CO2 comes in, and 2%, which is dangerous, getting dangerous, it goes up to a high rate of firing. And once these cells, these CO2 receptors, they fire like our fire alarms. Once they're triggered, they keep going and are loud, at least to the bee's brain. Here's an example of an experimental test that I did of raising the CO2 level in a nest and seeing whether it elicited fanning. Everything else was the same. This colony was living in an observation hive. It was at night, so they didn't need to cool the hive. In fact, it was a small colony. It was having trouble keeping warm. And when I started the experiment, there was no fanning. Number of fanning bees, very, very low. CO2 level was normal, about 0.5%. That's typical in a bee colony. But then I introduced CO2, I raised it up, and then it turned on the fanning. And CO2 got to 10%. I knew I had to shut it off because I was getting too dangerous for the bees. And then fanning stopped. And yeah, so very clear response to CO2. And that's a pretty cool behavior too. So here we are. We've looked at 5 impressive skills of worker bees: providing directions to important places with waggle dances, calling for help in the honey-making process with tremble dances, rousing sleepy hive mates in the morning by going around and shaking them with shaking signals, requesting help in grooming when a bee's body has gotten soiled, dirty, by performing a grooming invitation dance, and then finally monitoring CO2 levels in the nest and ventilating the nest accordingly. And they do that with their special CO2 receptors and then fanning. Now, those are five stories, and it's just a peek at the skills of worker honeybees. And if you would like to learn about 20 more of these stories and get a fuller report on the 5 that I did talk about, I can recommend this book, which has been kindly mentioned already by the hosts. So, that's my show, my talk for today, and I think. Now, what should I do, folks? Should I leave the meeting?
No, I think that's perfect.
Okay, good. So
Thank you
hope we're
very
not
much.
too late.
No,
It's
no,
quite a
not at all.
slow.
To be honest, I think we're just getting going. If you have time for some questions, then we have plenty of
I'd be
those.
delighted. Right, and I should go to the chat, I guess. There we go.
Yeah, I'll try and summarize the ones that I've seen.
Okay.
So the first question was in relation to von Frisch's work on scents. Do you know what scents he was training the bees to differentiate?
Yes, he did quite a variety of them. I think he did about 50 different ones, and not surprisingly, the ones that they learned to discriminate the best were the floral scents, because those were the scents that they would be encountering in nature. So so there, I remember the jasmine and he used citral before he knew that he thought that was a lemongrass scent. He didn't realize it was a pheromone at the time. So it was many different scents. I'd have to go back to his early paper and see it. The paper is about 80 pages long, and so it's got wonderful tables that list exactly what he used.
Right. A number of questions about red white, who's obviously a bee. It sounds as if you were quite attached to in her progress. Did you see any correlation between the number of bees going to the feeder after she went back and did the shaking of the other bees, or the trembling dance, I should say?
Yeah, I didn't show that in that graph. Once she was going back and doing the making her signals of uh, 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 she would, yes, it did arouse other bees, and I did, um, there were 30 bees trained to come to that feeder that knew about that feeder. And as soon as she was walking around shaking those bees, and she was probably, maybe not able to discriminate her 29 other forager mates at the feeder, but it does really get things going because she shakes for, yeah, about 8 trips back, and then she starts combining shaking with waggling. So she really announces the presence in 2 ways, both to familiar foragers and unfamiliar ones.
So in terms of sequence of events, which one of the other questions that she doesn't immediately show a waggle dance so that the bees that have just been activated know where to go.
Yeah, that's right. That's an interesting point. No, her first priority is just to get bees active. Yeah. So, and probably because this food source we gave was a very good one. And so in her calculus, it made sense to activate the bees that knew about it quickly rather than her taking time to do the waggle dance, which is actually believe it or not, the recruitment process can be pretty slow when the food source is hundreds of meters away.
Right.
But bees that know about it, they'll go quickly, of course.
And in terms of the desirability, is that a subjective assessment by an individual bee, or these are the flowers I like, or is it feedback from the nectar receivers saying, "Oh, this is really good quality. Go and encourage more"?
That's a very important question. It is, first and foremost, it is the individual forager. She's making an assessment of the goodness. It's like she can go out and all on her own, she can rank that nectar source as on a scale of 1 to 10, just to imagine that's how they do it. That said, so they have a built-in sense of goodness. However, how quickly she finds somebody to take her nectar tells her what level on that scale of goodness is good enough to elicit waggle dancing. So if she comes back and she's met very quickly, she'll do a dance even if the food source rates only say a 2 or a 3 on her 1 to 10 scale. But if she comes back and is met by and is not met quickly, and it takes her, as we saw, maybe more than 40 or 50 seconds, she won't even do a waggle dance at all. She'll shift over to doing the tremble dance because she realizes that more bees need to be activated for the receiving process.
And does she transmit any scent or, I guess, taste from what she's been eating rather than just the waggle dance in terms of communicating more generally what she was feeding on to sort of help other bees hone in on the particular flowers that were of interest?
Yes, to the best of our knowledge, the main way that the dance follower learns the scent is by smelling the scent that is adhered to the wax on her body and on the hairs of her body. So she comes in kind of like us if we were wearing perfume, radiating a cloud of floral scent. Probably not very much from the food itself.
One possibly slightly more controversial question, still on the subject of the waggle dance, is whether or not it's being questioned at the moment, or whether or not the bees send a very exact location, or possibly point other bees towards an sort of intermediate step for them to find their own way thereafter? Or is the waggle dance set in stone, as it were?
Well, it seems like there may be two questions there. The first one is, do we know that the waggle dance actually provides that the information that is in a waggle dance about distance and direction, do we know for sure that the dance followers use that information? And there were done a number of very elegant experiments that show that. These are ones where I don't it's a little hard to describe them in detail, but you can contrive things so that the bees that are following the dance think that the information is in a different location, and they go out to that other location, which the dancing bee never visited herself. So that means that the bee that's been recruited to this other location has not followed a bee to get to that location, and has not been guided to that location by any scent. So those are called these misdirection experiments. So yeah, we do know that the waggle dance plays a very important role, but we also know, and this gets at the other part of your question, that the scent is very, very important for the last step of the process of recruitment. Depending on the distance of the recruitment target, it can be quite a large area over which the recruit has to search to find the flowers. But in nature, the flowers can often be in large patches, and those patches can be quite sweet smelling. And so they're in the last stage of the recruitment process. Yes, indeed, the recruited bees are looking for that scent source, the source of the scent that they detected on the dancing bee.
Presumably things like the air temperature have an impact on the scent and so on. Is there any experimentation on air temperature in relation to this?
Only in relation to the willingness of the foragers to go out of the hive.
Right.
I don't know if air temperature would also affect the rate at which the floral scents are released by the flowers, but I think the bees, they make do as well as they can, even just so long as the temperature is warm enough for them to fly safely.
It would be a powerful message.
The bees that are really the kind of the record holders for flying at low temperatures are sometimes the water collectors.
Right.
You can see that in the winter cool times. They really get very, very, very thirsty.
Are you able to expand a little bit on the use of acoustics as part of the dancing? So I've understood quite a bit of vibration is conveying information, as well as the orientation on the frame and so on.
Yeah, there's two kind of acoustical cues in the waggle dance. One is the waggling motion itself creates vibrations in the comb, which bees can use to detect that there's a waggle dance being done. And there's some evidence that they can also orient by sensing the pattern of vibrations in the comb, in what direction they should walk to get near the dancer, closer to the dancer. And then once they are close to the dancer, then the way they detect the duration of the waggle run is acoustically. It's done acoustically because that bee, as she's doing the waggle run, she's vibrating her wings and making air vibrations on her body, which are the other bees can detect. It's called near field sound. They detect these vibrations with the vibrations of their antennae. It's called near field sound because if you get really close to a sound source, the air, you can feel the air rocking back and forth if you've got a very sensitive thing like these antenna. So yeah, they do hear these. They feel the vibrations through the comb to orient to the dancer, and they sense the air molecule vibrations to hear closely how precisely how long each waggle run lasts. And that gives them the direct distance information.
If we sorry, going back to a few more questions about scents actually. In your work on beelining, I think you use anise rather as one of the lures. What is it about anise you think that is particularly attractive to bees? So I must admit, I thought for bait hives it was lemongrass as the way to attract bees.
Yeah, lemongrass works very well for bait hives because that is the scent, that's the pheromone released by nest site scouts to help their fellow swarm mates find their fellow nest site scouts. We find that in a foraging context, which is different, of course, from the nest site scouting context, of all the scents that people have tested that I know of, for some reason, anise is the one that the bees are most responsive to, and that's why I have used it. I've tried using the scent of oranges and the scent of lemon, and you can have bees go to the same food source, same location, the same sugar quality, but if you change the scent, the recruitment to your food source is higher with the anise than with the lemon or the orange. I don't know why that is. It may be that, and here's I wish I knew more about the botany of the situation. It may be that the plants that use the anise as a floral scent are very, very productive for bees. So they're kind of primed to be excited by that scent. Whereas some of the other scents, such as lemon, those probably are not such rich nectar sources, so that the bees aren't as tuned to that.
And is there personal sensitivity around particular bees? Some like some scents more than others, a bit like people, you think?
Well, individual worker bees do vary a lot in their response thresholds for a variety of scents, but I don't know if that's a preference or just a level of sensitivity. For example, I know that best for the carbon dioxide. Some bees start responding at a very low level of CO2, and others it takes a much higher level for them to be stimulated to fan.
If sorry, coming back to nectar gathering again, if there is a particular deficiency in the diet of a particular colony, does that affect their choice of which nectars? Or is that more a pollen question, I guess?
Yeah, I think that's going to be more of a pollen question. Nectar is a very simple food. It's basically a carbohydrate source, whereas pollen has a much richer composition. It's proteins and fats and minerals, and there probably is work on that, but I don't know whether there are particular materials that the bees run short of, and thus some pollens will be particularly attractive to them for that reason. Something is in the back of my brain that's saying yes, but but I'm not pulling up the details.
Okay. A couple of questions about the desirability again, which is obviously quite an interesting topic. Can you just clarify a bit more about the desirability in terms of joules being spent, joules being gained, and how that sort of equation pans out in practice?
Yeah, it is that it's like miles per, you could use the analogy of miles per gallon. So a car that if these bees were getting, so many joules of nectar, of energy per joule spent. That's like getting so many miles traveled per gallon of fuel spent. So that's what's going on here. And you could imagine it could be something else. But for a long time, many biologists thought that it was the rate of energy gained that a bee could accomplish by going to a patch of flowers, so joules per second or joules per half hour or something like that. But no, these bees are, it doesn't seem to be a race for them. It's not, what really matters to them is efficiency. They like food sources where they can get energy cheaply, efficiently. And when you think about it from a bee's perspective, that makes a lot of sense, because a honeybee colony stores up energy. It's not trying to build up a quick supply of energy, but it's trying to amass a big supply of energy and to do it. And so they're tuned to do that as efficiently as possible. We don't know on the pollen foragers, on the other hand, we don't know what the currency is. And that's a really good mystery, because some pollens are better protein and fat sources than others, but I don't know if the bees judge that. Nobody knows, to the best of my knowledge.
And do they also use waggle dances to identify propolis sources or water sources, or is it floral?
Yes. Yeah. No, the waggle dance is used to indicate nectar sources, pollen sources, propolis sources, water sources, and nest sites. So it's very can be used in many different functions: the house hunting, the foraging, the propolis collecting, the water collection, and each of those is a talk in itself, a very fascinating talk. The bees that I find particularly fascinating are the propolis collectors, because if you're a nectar collector, you come back with your nectar and you pass it off and you're done with it. That's the end of that trip, and you go back and do another one. If you're a pollen forager, it's a little more work. Or I should say water, it's the same thing. It's just like nectar. You pass it off to a hive. Pollen's a little more work, because you walk around and you have to find a cell to kick the pollen loads off into. But the propolis collectors, they combine collecting propolis and working propolis. So they will go up to where the colony is using the propolis to seal up cracks or whatever, and they will stand there part of the time so others can take propolis off of them, but they will also work the propolis. And so those are the you might say the propolis collectors are the trickiest, have the trickiest set, or the richest set of skills of both combining collecting and processing the material they've collected. Really fun to watch. If you have an observation hive, you'll see them in the late summer, early fall, not in the spring or early summer.
My bees are in woodland, and there is just propolis everywhere. The hives are very full. In fact, I went to inspect one, I could barely get the frames out. It was just glued together.
Yeah, and
that's my problem.
Yeah, and that is, I'm sure your hives are a very, very healthy place for your colonies to inhabit because of all that propolis. Yeah.
Fingers crossed. A couple more technical questions, if you don't mind, coming back again to waggle dances. So someone has asked if the footprint pheromone enhances the efficacy of the waggle dance. I must admit that's not a pheromone I'm familiar with, so apologies if I've misunderstood that.
Yeah, they have tarsal glands, and it leaves footprints. They can leave footprints. They usually, I think those are put down not intentionally, but just through the activity of the traffic of foragers. And I think it just helps the bees, maybe the beginning foragers, know where the entrance is or which way to walk as they come into the hive. We don't know very much about the footprint pheromone. Or even its function, but you can easily see that when the bees have got a nest that a hive they've inhabited a long time, they seem to go in and out of it very easily, partly because the bees are experienced, but probably also because the entrance is well marked with that pheromone, the footprint pheromone.
Does that plastic foundation make a difference to the dancing and the vibration impact?
Yeah, we
Should anyone
looked
be
at that.
using plastic foundation in a hive? He said, disparagingly.
Well, we looked. We one of the things that I've done with a collaborator in Germany who uses this. So we have a laser vibrometer system for measuring the comb vibrations for combs that are beeswax combs that are built either on beeswax foundation or plastic foundation, and the plastic foundation, the comb vibrations, which are involved in helping the dance followers orient to a waggle dancing bee, those comb vibrations they dampen out quickly. A lot of energy is absorbed by the heavyweight plastic that is the midrib of a comb. And when we did studies where we looked at the dance effectiveness of bees dancing, just behavioral experiments, dancing on combs built with plastic on top of plastic foundation versus beeswax foundation, we found that the distance over which a waggle dancer would attract dance followers was markedly smaller. I can't remember the exact number, but it doesn't seem like the comb vibrations do not work as well on combs that are built on plastic foundation. And so I know they're handy and they're very sturdy and all that sort of stuff, but they do come at some cost of disruption to the bees' normal communications.
Right. So here's a question on waggle dances I should have thought of actually. When we were talking about they use waggle dances for a number of different different kinds of forage, do they communicate what they're talking about? This is how to get to suitable propolis, this is how to get to a suitable source of nectar, this is how to get to a suitable source of pollen.
I like this question because it really gets at the question of what's the meaning of communication.
Right.
Dance followers know whether the bee is advertising pollen or propolis or water or probably nectar, but it's not a signal. It's just what we would call a cue. If you've brought home propolis, you've got these propolis loads which smell like resin. If you've collected pollen, you've got the pollen loads. And with water, it's probably you don't smell like anything special unless you've got this,
so to speak. Yeah.
So I think it's a really good and important question and something we don't really know very well but that is to say whether pollen dance followers are selective to follow us, or they're seeking a certain kind of dancer when they go down to the dance floor. I wouldn't be surprised if they do. I can imagine bees that are feeling that the colony is overheating, and they want to help collect water. I would imagine they can figure out a way to follow a dance for a water collector. By virtue of its absence of pollen and its absence of floral scent.
So I'm going to apologize. I've got a cat behind me trying to get out of a cat flap who's being a bit of a nuisance. So does that help? No. Okay, she can stay there a bit longer. One question I should know the answer to, but I don't know, is when they collect propolis, where is it carried? Is it in pollen baskets, or do they digest it?
Yeah, it's in the pollen baskets, and they stick it in there. They chew off little chunks of it, and then they pass it back to the pollen baskets using the same procedure that they use when they are transferring pollen rearward. They pass it back from foreleg to midleg, finally padded in place on the hind legs. And it doesn't stick to their bodies because it's not a sticky material for them to handle because I believe because of the wax that's on the wax coating on their bodies, the bees' bodies.
Lucky them, because it gets everywhere. I said I have a lot of propolis. Everything I own is covered in propolis. It's quite difficult taking pictures and things without your phone being covered in propolis.
Yeah, it is. Indeed.
Another question about dancing is obviously very popular. Lots of dancers in tonight. Is there a part of the comb where they dance the most?
Yes.
I kind of feel instinctively as it's going to be the middle, but that might not be true.
It's down near the entrance to minimize the distance that it's in the under it's particularly for the nectar foragers. It's clear they like to come in, get unloaded, and go right back out. So they tend to do their dancing near the entrance. In contrast, the other extreme are the propolis or resin collectors. They don't stay near the entrance. They walk up to whatever the work sites are where propolis is being used. They've learned that somehow. So that's where they go up and they will do their dances, because that's where their clientele is hanging out.
Right.
Pollen foragers, I think it's usually near the entrance.
And
water collectors are usually met at the entrance by desperate bees that
very
really
thirsty
are.
bees. Yeah. One interesting question. Again, I feel as if I should know the answer to that. The bees will obviously collect nectar from a number of different plants with different characteristics. Do they eat it in a particular order? When they store for the winter, do they just access the nearest possible honey, or do they select a particular kind of honey that they collected at a particular time?
I don't know if anybody's studied that, but just based on my observations as a beekeeper, it looks to me like they go to the honey in the winter. They'll just eat honey from the cells that are closest to their cluster. And as those cells get emptied, they shift the cluster to stay in touch with the honey stores.
They don't think they're bored of eating oilseed rape honey this week. They'd rather go and try a bit of lime honey from somewhere else just to make a bit of a change.
Probably not. It's probably about calories for them.
Yeah, yeah. I think I've covered most of the specific questions. Apologies to anyone if I haven't. If you want to resend if I've missed something, because there were quite a lot flying through and I may have skipped over a couple. But just while you do that, if I can, Tom, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions that are of interest to me, and they're a bit less specific to your talk, but just having read your book, which is a bit more autobiographical. Do you remember the first time you were stung? So you talk a bit about the first time you saw a swarm, but I suspect for many people, the first time they were stung is quite a powerful memory.
I don't have a
Or
strong
have you
memory.
never been stung in all of your years of beekeeping?
I actually estimated that I've been keeping bees for 50 years, and I estimate maybe 20, 25 stings a year, so about over 1,000 stings over my time. But I don't remember the first time I was stung. I can remember the first time my father was stung because he got stung by some of my bees and I had to help him remove the stingers. So, but I don't remember my first sting. It was not a horrible experience. It was attention grabbing, but it wasn't repellent to me.
Right. That's obviously given people a chance to send some questions that I skipped over by accident when I was going down this list, because there's lots of things flying in on the chat. Any clues? Sorry, a few about grooming actually. So firstly, any clues to activation coming from the subgenual or trochoid sensilla? That is a very technical question that hopefully means more to you than it does to me. So apologies.
Not that I know of. Those are the sensilla or mechanoreceptors on the body. I don't. That's a question. We don't have a precision, at least to the best of my knowledge. We don't have precise information about which of those hair type receptors are the bees give priority to when they've picked up some propolis, some undesired propolis or other material. I would guess it's going to be those involved with the wing hinges, but that's just a guess.
And have you seen that grooming behavior help against varroa? Because I think people have reported that varroa resistant bees relate to grooming. I think possibly in Apis cerana.
Yeah. I don't know much about varroa. We have the luxury over here of having lots and lots of wild colonies. There are many more where the part of the world I live, the kind of remote part of the hills of New York State, there's probably, I don't know what the exact ratio is, but most of the colonies are wild colonies. And we know that when the varroa came in the early mid 90s, there was a massive die-off of wild colonies because I was monitoring a population of wild colonies. But then the population reestablished itself within 10 years. And we did a very sophisticated genetic analysis, or one of my postdocs did. and it was very clear that population went through a genetic bottleneck, and there was selection on their genome in all sorts of locations and all sorts of genes. So I don't worry much about Varroa. I have that luxury these days. I haven't treated for Varroa in about 8 years. I don't think I've seen Varroa in quite a while even.
Wow. I think
yeah, it's kind of, I think that's optimistic for parts of the UK, maybe in Scotland, maybe some remote parts of Ireland. That I think there's some evidence that that has happened also in those parts, remote places too,
right.
at least in Ireland.
No, Varroa is still very much present around Cambridge, as indeed is still quite a lot of EFB, European foul brood, still is relatively common
wherever there's
around
a high
Cambridge.
density. Yeah, the commercial beekeepers over here, Varroa is enemy #1 for sure.
Right.
But it's
coming back again to energy profitability on foraging trips, does that apply to pollen as well, or just to nectar?
probably just to nectar. Nobody's really looked carefully at the metric the bees use to assess the goodness of a pollen source, and I bet it's not just energetics. The quality of pollen varies in other dimensions besides energy content. So I think the bees may be paying attention to the quality of the pollen as well as the cost of collecting it.
Okay, so I think we're seeing somebody else's stream there. In terms of bees being shaken awake, are some bees more morning people or morning bees rather than evening bees, deeper sleepers?
Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah, in those studies of sleep, your question's very, very pertinent to what we observed in the sleep studies. And these were mostly by a gentleman named Barrett Klein, Dr. Barrett Klein. He's the world's insect sleep specialist, but he started with honeybees. Yeah, there are some bees that just get up in the morning and go and get the ball rolling. And it's funny to see them come in. They have fellow foragers gone to the same feeding station as the first bees to get up, but they're deep asleep. And then when they're shaken to be woken up, it really looks like you're waking up. If you have memories of waking up a roommate or something like that, they're really out of it for about 5 or 10 minutes sometimes, and they quickly, or not quickly, they gradually groom themselves, groom their antennae, brush off their body, and then walk down near the entrance. I don't see any signs of doing so grudgingly, but some are eager beavers and some are not. And one sees that tending a feeder as well. Some come frequently, some come more occasionally.
I'm sure I heard someone speak about super forages, that in any beehive or colony, there's about 10% of the bees do 50% of the foraging. It seems to be a bit like my workplace.
I haven't heard that, and I don't know, so I haven't seen a study on that.
Right.
Coming back to I do have a lot of experience in following individuals coming to my little feeding stations, the sugar water feeding stations. And yeah, there are some that are very reliable, very quick, and others that are much more intermittent in their visits. But it was my strong impression that those bees that started becoming intermittent visitors or slow returners, they were near the end of their life, because it wasn't long when you started seeing that. It wasn't long before they just stopped coming, and we couldn't find them in the hive. So we have to be understandable. You get old and you can't quite do as well as when you're only 21 days old. You get to be 30, 35 days old.
As I said, I don't remember being 21 days old, but I'm sure I was. I'm sure I was. I've got a very specific US, I think, centric question, which I'm just going to read out, hopefully. So apparently a study by Carl Hayden of the University of Agriculture's bee research stating that warmer summers and winters could cause bee colony collapse, and that 30% of US beekeepers are putting their bees into cold storage over winter just above freezing, housing 10 to 80,000 hives.
Mhm.
Is that something that you're aware of or familiar with or have a view on?
I've read about it. It's a way of putting the bees in a very controlled situation. So it's neither they never warm up during the winter, but then they don't experience the deep, many tens of degrees below 0 centigrade that they can encounter on the Great Plains. So yeah, that I guess it's a very sophisticated process because you've got to ventilate those vast spaces where the hives are stored. But it also means that the bees are kept at their a cluster of bees. It minimizes its energy consumption when the ambient temperature is, I think, around 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and that would be what, 5 or so degrees centigrade. So, and I think that's part of the logic of that too. They can get colonies through the winter in good condition with consuming relatively small honey stores, small amounts of honey. It's yeah, I don't know much about that because I'm not in a part of the country where there's a lot of large scale commercial beekeeping, and there's not much migratory beekeeping, much at all.
We also have a question from someone in the Sonoran Desert, which apologies, I don't know whereabouts that may be, who's curious about how feral colonies collect resources and store them in, excuse my pronunciation, saguaros. Does that mean much to you?
Yeah.
Saguaro.
Saguaro, I think it's pronounced. Yeah, this is a part of New Mexico. It's a very arid part of the country. And there's some very interesting studies of water collection from that part of the world. Sometimes there are natural sources of water, but very often they will be going to places where cattle ranchers have provided a watering trough for their cattle. And that's people have measured the distances at which water collectors will go to get water for their colony. And these are not beehive colonies, because managed colonies that people can provide water nearby. There was a gentleman that located wild colonies up in the rocks, up in the canyons, and then figured out where they were going to get their water. And I think he found him traveling something like 15 kilometers sometimes to get a load of water, which is sort of hard. I don't fully understand how that's physiologically possible, because if your honey stomach, if your crop is full of water, you can't run. You don't have a fuel tank. That's not a fuel tank. They must have some metabolic tricks that I don't know about to manage such long flights.
So no varroa. The US has no varroa and no rain, so completely different to beekeeping in the UK, where we have plenty of varroa and plenty of rain, and we can share it round.
Oh, please don't misunderstand me. There's only a few places, well, most places where there's commercial beekeeping, there's varroa galore. Yeah, just the management practices of. One of the things that helps a colony control varroa a lot, I know because I've done this, is artificially, is swarming. You export a lot of the adult varroa in the swarm, but most importantly, you create a break in the brood rearing. So if you've got bees that have some ability to kill varroa, the varroa can't hide during that broodless period following swarming. So we know that's a big part of the story in the wild, is that the brood breaks that come with swarming. We've done experiments that look at that.
Thank you to Anthony for confirming a saguaro is a tree-like cactus species.
Yes.
So
it's the iconic one that goes up and branches out with grows up vertical form, but forms. They use them in a lot of cowboy movies and things like that.
I might recognize one if I saw it, but yeah. More generally, in terms of the bees that you study, are they Linguistica or Carniolan or any particular subspecies of Apis mellifera?
Yeah, when we did the genetic analyses of the bees surviving and before and after varroa, or before and with varroa, part of that analysis did look at the subspecies composition. And they are about, it's about 40% Ligustica, 40% Carnica, 10% Apis mellifera mellifera, and then there was some Africanized stock in there. So most of, yeah, that is the mix that we have of the wild colonies living in the woods outside of New York. But that's the only place that it's really been examined closely. For hundreds of years it was just Apis mellifera mellifera. The Italian and the Carniolan races were not introduced in large numbers until early in the late 1800s, early 1900s. But and I rather like your Apis mellifera mellifera. I know it can be somewhat touchy, but not everywhere. So I know there are parts of Wales, Northwest Wales, where they're very peaceful colonies, and I guess I like them because they seem pretty rugged to me. When I've had colonies of really black bees that collect a lot of propolis, for which Apis mellifera mellifera is famous, those are very hardy colonies. So I wish we had more of those, a greater percentage of the Apis mellifera mellifera.
Well, that may be what mine are, locally adapted mongrel bees that have been donated to me by a fellow beekeeper many years ago, and the lineage is still going, collecting as much propolis as they like.
I see. Yeah.
Someone has asked about Russian bees. I don't quite know much about Russian bees. They're probably all sanctioned at the moment.
Yeah, I think that term was applied to bees that were brought from Eastern Russian Empire, and the attraction of them, I've forgotten the special name they were given, was that these were bees that had co-evolved with Varroa. They'd been dealing with Varroa, and the idea was that they would have, through selection over time, because they were the first European honeybees to be exposed to Varroa, they were imported by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and they established a line of those bees. It has not, Primorsky, I think is the region of Russia. That line, to the best of my knowledge, hasn't caught on. I think it's because those bees can be pretty defensive, and particularly when they crossbreed with bees that are not of their group. So that's basically that's what I know. I don't have any in particular, I don't have any firsthand experience with the Russian bees. And yeah, what was it? Oh, there's some really good jokes around them though, too. I think of one. Maybe not for tonight.
Oh, I don't know. I think you're committed now.
If I can think of it, I'll
Well, to be honest, I think we're pretty much at time. So I think lots of messages from people saying how much they've enjoyed your talk, looking forward to reading your book. So I think all that remains is for me to, oh, no, sorry, one last question. What's your favorite honey dish? There you go. That's a good question to end on, isn't it?
Honey dish? Comb honey. Comb honey. What do I like to put it on? English muffins are very good. Yeah, something where it doesn't, its flavor is not really where I can really enjoy the flavor of the honey per se, not other things combined.
A particular honey cake recipe or sauce, honey sauce?
No, I don't. I really like straight honey, and I really like the dark, very rich, strong flavored honeys. That said, I do like to put honey on ice cream. So,
oh, okay.
So vanilla ice cream doesn't blunt the flavors of the honey, and they sort of complement each other. Both very sweet.
So before we go, I'd just like to say a big thank you to Professor Seeley for talking to us to promote his book, which I hope you have all now ordered. It does look from the online chat as though quite a few people have been ordering as we go. There was a link to the Northern Bee Books website for people in the UK.
Peter,
our
can I
next-
just interrupt? Tom did say that they've run out, so
For
Mac
now.
takes-
I'm sure there'll be more copies available.
Yeah, I think Brendan will airmail a crate of them or something.
So if you'd like to take yourselves off mute and give Tom a big round of applause, that was
Thank you.
very good. Excellent.
Thanks very much. That was great.
Thank you very much. Brilliant.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
you.